You're listening to Parents You've Got This, the expert guide to parenthood, the complete guide to fertility, pregnancy, birth, baby and parenthood. This podcast is proudly supported by Mistela, a natural origin skincare for babies and children, recommended by healthcare professionals. Mistela by Parents' Side since 1950.
This week on the Expert Guide to Parenthood podcast, we're going to delve deep into birth order. So, has your personality got to do with the order that you were born in? Are you a very organised person? Are you a silly, fun, jovial person? Are you really uptight? Or maybe you're just totally lovable. Everyone loves you.
And maybe you be that way regardless of whether you were born number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or 6. Who knows? Well, we have an idea of someone who might. We are joined today by our child psychologist expert, Deirdre Brandner, who has more than 30 years of experience working with families and with children on a whole host of different things. Dee, you really have seen it all, and we are so blessed to have you as part of the Parents You've Got This expert team. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, first of all, Dee, does a child's birth order, where they were born in the order of their siblings, have an impact on their personality?
Research tells us that it doesn't really. It's actually more about how we respond to the birth order. So they're not born a certain way because they're number 1, 2, 3 or 4, but they do tend to display certain personalities that come about as a function of that. In saying that, it's not set in stone, and there are many other things that will affect your child's temperament or personality besides the fact of what number they fit in the family. But there are some general traits and attributes that we attribute to certain birth order statements.
Oh, that's so fascinating, because often people say, I parented them all the same way.
Yep.
But did you really? Because you
Yes.
grew as a parent as you went along, and maybe you only had one, so you could respond to their needs quicker.
Yeah.
And maybe as they went down, it was harder to respond to them, or you may have laid back a little bit as you realised,
Yep.
it doesn't really matter that they're having a bit of TV, or, some of those things that potentially for your first one, it did really matter. And I
Yes.
remember that just for myself,
Yeah.
I think about my children and their birth order. There's 4 of them. I do think that some of the typical traits are associated with each place that they were born in, but I also think I changed as a parent along the way.
Definitely. Yeah.
So if you're talking about some of those typical traits, what does a firstborn typical trait look like?
Well, in response to parents, so first-time parents are usually very much going on their instinct. A lot of it's trial and error. They've got a lot more time and attention to give to that first child. So generally what we tend to see is first children are more likely to be very high achievers. They're very structured, they're very reliable, and at times, though, they can be great leaders, but this can sometimes delve into the idea of wanting to have control over everything. But they're very much linked to that relationship with their parents because they've got a lot of time to spend with them, and so that's quite a connection. They usually end up receiving a lot of positive interaction and positive acknowledgement from their parents because there's just the one.
Oh, and then that makes sense in that they would want to be high achievers.
Yes.
The parents want them to be so fabulous because it's their only one, and they've got all that time and energy to give all the help.
Yep.
But that's also a lot of pressure for number 1.
Can be. Yep.
Yeah.
What about number 2, Dee? What's the role or what are the traits in a second-born?
Yeah. So number 2, we tend to, as parents, have taken, a step back and we're not as still hugely invested, but we're a bit calmer about it. And what we usually notice about the second child, and remember, this is general, they're usually more agreeable because they've had to slot in to a certain situation. They can sometimes be a little bit more rebellious. They'll push the boundaries just to see how it goes. And they're very much like to be people pleasers because there's now 3 people that they're trying to get some attention of. And so they'll try to, work around things. Sometimes, they can have more access and be more focused on friends than the firstborn because they've had all this social experience because they've got a sibling and they're out there mixing it up with their friends. So second born children generally usually have a wider circle of friends than their firstborn does.
Wow. Is this ringing true to your family,
It's
Frey?
fascinating. Certainly the social side of it.
Yep.
Absolutely. The people pleaser, totally. It's really amazing.
What about if you've had a third child?
Yes.
What's the third child like?
So by that stage, usually parents there's a very laissez-faire. Generally, they're just chilled and it's all going okay, and our third child likes to take advantage of that. We sometimes see that they're very social and very fun and very agreeable, quite the charmer, because they have to do that. They have to give that bit extra to get more response from mum and dad. They usually tend to be a little bit more mischievous, break more rules, because usually mum and dad have not been able to keep up with the discipline quite the same way. So they can try to sort of work around the boundaries a bit. But, what we do know is in terms of analysis that a lot of comedians and actors are actually
I can see that.
third-born children.
I can see that.
They're
in
the
my
entertainers.
Hilarious. Buddy, you're a superstar. You're awesome. But also, it was funny when you were saying like parents have relaxed a little. I also think what happens is when you have more children, they're getting access to things. So, for example, my daughter, she was the firstborn. She did not have chocolate until she was 5. Sorry, Hope. And then, whereas little Hunter, he's number 4. Well, of course he's going to have chocolate before that age because the bigger ones were. And they were having it. And how do I say you can't have a Freddo frog?
Exactly.
So that sort of thing happens. I don't know. Did you find that, Frey?
Yeah, definitely. And I think even things like sleeping, with my firstborn, it was like, well, he hasn't been asleep and I was stressed about that, and then he was overtired and I was overtired and the whole thing was like this. But then with my third son, it was like, well, he'll just sleep on me when he's ready and he'll, we're on the move anyway.
Yes, because your circumstances have changed, isn't it? You've got school pickup and drop-off, which you didn't have before.
He's amazing. He's 7 and he'll still have a 10-minute cat nap after lunch at school.
Yep, love it.
He's my superpower snoozer, like the one that I didn't do anything to support in that way. It's crazy. So crazy.
Well, what about crazy people like myself who've had 4?
Yes,
very crazy.
What's the 4th person like?
So the first, as we go down the line, it's more, sometimes they'll be more impacted not just by mum and dad, by the 4th child, but by older siblings.
Absolutely.
And we often see that, they will buddy up, not necessarily to the eldest, but to one of the others. But what's really important, and we know this is a fact, that no 2 children have the same role in a family.
It's so true, isn't it? Their own individual person, regardless of their birth order.
Yeah.
That's
So
right.
even, when we say the youngest, well, you're only the youngest for a certain amount of time and then someone else takes that spot. So, there's a lot of change and growth. So, we know that children, we know that 4th children and subsequent tend to have a lot more social skills and a lot more life skills because they've been exposed to a greater range and they've watched the development of their siblings.
Yes.
So, and they've had to collaborate and be more ingenious in the way they manage other people's attention and getting their own needs met. I'm not saying you neglected your 4th child, but I'm just...
Sometimes though, like I think about my firstborn and I think, she would have like made a tiny whimper. I'd be like, run and get the water bottle. The next one I'd be like, oh yeah, your water, here's 2 water bottles. Oh, now I've lost 10. So you're going to have to wait, buddy, till I get your water bottle. Whereas Hunter, my 4th, he's already pushed the chair over. He's got the tap on. He's filled up his own water bottle.
Every man for himself over around here.
But interestingly, he's the 4th one. It was harder for him to have more friends because he was used to being directed with his play. So all of his siblings, they told him in imaginary play, if we're playing, I know one's a dog and, you're the dog. And so then once he got to school, he was like, who's telling me to be the dog? Or whatever whatever the role was. He didn't know how to do that. Yeah. And he really missed having them around.
That's hard.
He pretty much became a single child in that space of going to prep. He was like, I have to make friends on my own. I don't already have a buddy always around to play.
Yeah. So, there is advantages and disadvantages for whatever birth order it is. But remember, first of all, every child is an individual, and we have to keep that in mind.
Dee, regardless of the number of children, are there any sort of generalizations,
Yes.
I guess we're talking about, for the last born child? You know, is the last born always the baby of the family? You know, what are the dynamics for the last born child?
Usually they are, and that can be difficult for them because I think sometimes we don't have enough time to, celebrate their milestones as much, and otherwise what can happen is they're parented by their older siblings, so they don't get that chance to really, have that moment themselves. It doesn't last forever though, and what we do see is, we might see that youngest child presentation in early primary up until mid-primary, but we don't usually see that at the secondary school setting. It's sort of been that once they've found their own tribe, found their people, found their friends, developed their own interests, which usually happens once they're at school, because then we've got a whole lot of other influences on their life, not just parents and not just siblings.
Yeah, and there can be so many positives of it too. I know our littlest one, everyone wants to play with him. He's like the baby, what's he doing? I want to play with him. So I think there are a lot of positives about the birth order, and the joy, I think, for those children, as you've learnt more, you've relaxed more as a parent potentially, and you get to experience a whole lot of more things because you'll be at that basketball or at the drop-off or at the football, so you've been watching that whole time. So by the time it's your turn, hang on.
Got it. How we do it. Thank you, someone, for giving me a ball.
Right. Just be waiting for that ball. So Dee, I guess with this knowledge, should we parent our children differently with the knowledge of, I guess, these things that may potentially be related to birth order?
I don't think we need to be parenting differently, but I think we need to be aware. I think we need to be mindful that, when our child, you mentioned before, that first child, can be striving to achieve and do the right thing, we need to make sure we give them time to relax and encourage them. We know that when the second child comes along and they're pushing the boundaries a bit because they can, we need to make sure that we give that second child the structure that they need. And we also need to help, the eldest child cope with the arrival of the second child.
It's so tough, isn't it? It
can be a lot of jealousy, understandably so, but there's also a lot of love. It can be tricky to say, how come this person's getting all this attention just because they're little, and I only get attention when I learn how to bring home my reader, or I can put my jammies on my own. So it is about making sure a balance. One of the things that we do know that sometimes the way we parent in terms of birth order is about our own experiences. So if you were the eldest child, when your eldest child arrives, you need to be aware that, when I was the eldest child, I had to do this and this, and I didn't like it. So be mindful of what we bring to the table, as parents, and what our interpretation of birth order is.
It's so true, and be wary not to project our own experience.
Oh, that's such good advice. And also too, I think for the little person, they're also individual, like what you're saying, and that it can be really hard for older siblings to see that mum is spending more time with the little one, but it might be, I always have to try and explain this to my older ones. When you were that little, I was sitting on your bed till you went to sleep. It's not that mum loves the little one more. It's that they're not capable of doing what you're doing. Exactly. But you get to go to sleepovers, or you get to do these other amazing things that they don't get to do. But it's hard because they always... I don't know about you, but I always feel like you love them more than I love me, constantly. And it's like, I actually really love you all the same. It's so hard for them to understand that. But I think with the birth order, sometimes it could be seen potentially you're babying one, or you want to spend more time with the older one, or, so it can be hard for that middle one that's kind of in the middle.
Who am I? Where do I belong?
Dee, what about for only children? How does what about... for them, obviously, birth order is not a thing, but they are the first. Is it the same as for a firstborn, or is it same as for a lastborn? What's the go there?
It's a bit different. It's a bit more complicated. Sometimes we say that only children, it's both a burden and a privilege because you've got parents' undivided attention, but with that can come, a lot of expectation. What we do know about only children is they tend to be leaders, very reliable, very conscientious, and quite mature in their development. Sometimes that can be a bit difficult if that idea of having control and leadership, if we hadn't have enough practice with social skills, it can come across as maybe a little bit bossy and maybe not as flexible. So that's why it's really important. And, I know lots of families who have, their one beautiful, precious child, and most people do their very best to make sure that they're accessing social opportunities, both out of school and within school. And as long as we're doing that with them and we're not, we're letting them be kids and not mini versions of ourselves.
Yes.
It's really important.
Yeah.
That's because there's no one to play with. And I think adults play so differently to children.
Oh, gosh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
And, you learn so much from your siblings. You try it out. As much as you can't bear them, pushing and shoving each other and calling each other names, they've got someone that loves them to try it out on before they get out into the
real
world.
world. Yeah.
Whereas your only child, potentially you're listening to things that were above your age that you wouldn't be listening to if you're off playing, or there's pressure from the parents to play with them.
Yeah.
So it can be tricky,
Yeah,
can't it?
it
But
can
then
be.
also too, you've always got someone watching your sporting events. How cool.
Yes.
Or
Yeah.
making sure your birthday is incredible.
Special. Yeah. You don't have to share that birthday.
That's it.
Oh, Dee, this is so fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us today on the
No
Expert
worries.
Guide to Parenthood podcast to talk all about birth order.
Thank you.
A huge thanks to Mistella for sponsoring this episode. Mistella empowers parents throughout their parenting journey with education and honest conversations from pregnancy and beyond. Mistella has plenty of parenting articles and resources on their website. Visit mistella.com.au. Mistella is our family's favourite. The Expert Guide to Parenthood podcast is proudly brought to you by Parents You've Got This in partnership with Mistella. Parents You've Got This has an expert team of more than 30 leading medical and health professionals, and we have masterclasses for every stage from when you're thinking of starting a family all the way through to primary school. So check us out and tune in to the next episode of the Expert Guide to Parenthood podcast. Never forget, parents.
You've got this.
Join a Parents You've Got This masterclass today to be prepared, excited and educated for pregnancy, birth, baby and parenthood. Visit www.parentsyou'vegotthis.com.au and sign up for a masterclass today.
The information provided in this podcast is general in nature and is intended to support, not replace, a discussion with your doctor or healthcare professional. Parents You've Got This take no responsibility for any medical decisions made by individuals based on the information provided in this podcast.